Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's really exciting for us to welcome Professor Christine Goh. She is Professor in Education at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, where the weather looks much nicer than it is here. I hope the background is real there.
No.
So I'm sure many of you are familiar with her book, Teaching and Learning Second Language Listening, which she co-authored with Larry Vandergrift. And her more generally her work in second language listening and speaking and student and teacher cognition. Of course, like all the best applied linguists, she started off as an English language teacher and a teacher educator, and her work always has really strong practical implications, which means it's had a huge influence on the work that we've done in CRELLA on cognitive validity. So today she's going to talk to us with the title, A Systems Model of Second Language Listening, Implications for Learning and Assessment. And we're all looking forward very much to hearing what she has to say. So over to you, Christine. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks for the invitation to share some of my ideas on second language listening. I'm going to share my slides now. And
wonderful. Thank you. Just to let you know, Christine, we can see your screen. You're sharing your screen beautifully. That works well.
Okay, and you can see my slide in presentation mode, or am I still
not yet?
Not yet. Okay.
Sometimes it does take a moment or two. There we go. Yes.
Yep, now it's good.
It. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you once again for having me in this seminar. So for today, I hope to be able to address two questions. And these questions are, what are the interdependent components in the systems model of second language listening? And how does such a model influence the way we think about teaching and learning listening and listening assessment? These are pretty straightforward questions, and I hope to be able to use the next 30 or 25 minutes to present some of my thinking on these two questions. And this is how I intend to structure my presentation. Let's see how it works. Yes, it's working. There'll be three parts to this short presentation. I'll give a systems model overview, basically sharing a bit about the background to how this model for second language listening was derived. And then I'll explain some of the details in the model. And finally, I will share some of the thoughts and considerations for teaching and learning and assessment based on the details in this systems model for second language listening. But before I go into this overview, I would just like to ask you to consider some of these excerpts from learners listening diaries, and just have a read and see what you make of it. And here's the next one. Well, I wanted to begin my presentation by showing you some of these excerpts from learners' listening diaries because of two reasons. One, I think it's really important that we understand some of the concerns that learners have. And this is just a very small sample of some of the concerns that they have, the problems that they face. So, for example, Ron has this problem about wondering about, his the greatest barrier to his listening is his inefficient memory. And here you see Ron actually talking about a particular factor that affects his listening. And over at May actually, to me, when I read this, May was actually sharing her anxiety. And yet, when she listened to the text the second time, instead of feeling more anxious, and she said in case that she didn't get a greater shock, she actually began quite hopeful and confident. And it's the same when you look at the other excerpts from the listening diaries. Now, another reason why I thought it'd be good to share this is that for me, I think it is really important for us to start with thinking about the work that we do as educators, as language educators, that would include teaching and assessing, to start that with thinking about our learners, putting our learners right in the center of what we do. Okay, so that's by way of a quick introduction to the way I'm going to frame this presentation. It is really looking at the different aspects of the learner's experience when they are listening, and this is what the model is going to present to you. But before I go into the second language listening model, I'd like to give some background to this model that Larry Vandergrift and I presented in our book, first in the 2012 version. This model actually is based on two other models. One is on general education by Biggs, and he talks about a systems model that is important for understanding how students learn. And a systems model basically presents different components of a whole and shows how these different components interact with one another, and this presents the experience and the learning experience and learning outcomes for students. So here you see three big sections, actually, or three parts. What Biggs called presage, which is essentially the factors that affect a student's learning. And some of these factors are not just internal to the students, but they're also the teaching context. The context in which they learn has an impact on how they learn. And the other section of this model has to do with the process. It has to do with the activities that are planned for learners to learn. And with the students' own prior knowledge, prior experience, and the processes, we will hope to see some learning outcomes based on the goals that have been set. And so this is what Biggs called the three Ps, the presage, process, and product. And the model for second language listening that I'm presenting to you here is actually adapted from Inhofe and Januszik's earlier work. So I wanted to give credit to both Biggs as well as Inhofe and Januszik on this model that I'm presenting to you. So based on the quick recollection of the three components of the systems model, you will find that you find three similar components here. The two big boxes on one side shows you the factors that can influence listening. And over here, you can see the first big box at the top that talks about person factors. So these are factors that are related to the listeners. And why is this important in the model of second language listening? I think it's really important because in order to understand how students or learners process what they hear, it is important to bear in mind the factors that can influence the efficiency and the success or the lack of it in the processing. And apart from the person factors are the listening context. And as you can see here, there are different aspects that are considered within the listening context. Normally, we would think about the environment as an important listening context. And it is definitely true because depending on whether students listen in informal or formal context, or whether they're listening in an assessment context, especially a high-stake assessment context, this will have a way of influencing the way they process and try to understand what they hear. And there are also different kinds of contexts that are related to task, the speaker, and the text. And these are what Rubin in 1994 actually referred to as the three of the five factors that influence listening. So these two boxes will present the first part of the model. And this represents the factors, both the internal and the external factors that influence listening. Now, in the middle portion is what Biggs would have called the learning activities and the learning itself. So here for second language listening, we have put in place the processes, the strategies, and the skills that are needed for processing information. And this would lead, hopefully, to some kind of comprehension or understanding on the part of the learners and the students. And over on the other side of the diagram, you'll see another big box. And these are the learning outcomes or the product of listening. Now, very often in the teaching of listening, we tend to focus more on the outcomes. So, for example, when I was a teacher many, many years ago of listening, one of the things I was concerned about was how much could my students understand? And that I think that is a valid concern. But at the same time, we also need to think about other kinds of outcomes. So the outcomes here are divided into two types following Biggs: quantitative outcomes and qualitative outcomes. And this has to do with the performance or the evidence that we see about how a learner reacts or responds to what they hear. And it also has to do with qualitative outcomes. And these are outcomes that sometimes we overlook, but they are just as important. Qualitative outcomes, positive relationships, motivation, self-efficacy, engagement, and confidence. If you remember the excerpt from May's diary, she was talking about listening to this story about the elephant. And the first time she couldn't hear very much. And she was very concerned that the second time was going to be just as bad. But because she could hear, understand a lot more, she had this spark of hope, she said. And that is a qualitative outcome of listening. So these are the three interactive components of a systems model of second language listening. And they interact in different ways. So for example, if you look at the person factors, you'll find that very often the person factors can directly affect the processes, the strategies, and the skills that learners use, and also the performance, the results of the comprehension. So for example, we know that in second language listening research, there's been a lot of work done on these person factors. So for example, we have research on how linguistic knowledge that involves vocabulary and grammar might impact or have an influence on listening performance, or whether they have this correlational relationship. And one of the things that we found, and I found when I was looking at some of the more recent research, is that one thing came out very clear in terms of linguistic knowledge, and that vocabulary, I guess we all knew that vocabulary is very important. But at the same time, we know that vocabulary also consists of two kinds of vocabulary: the vocabulary that we can hear as a learner, and the vocabulary as a learner they can see in print. So there are different facets to the importance of vocabulary knowledge. And this will directly influence the cognitive, social, and strategic processing. How, if, for example, linguistic knowledge is lacking in some of the learners, you might find that some of them actually would make use of other ways of understanding. So, for example, a study by in the Systems Journal by Wieland, they talked about that vocabulary is important, but at the same time, it did not seriously affect the comprehension product of the students. And they speculated that it could be because they were using other kinds of ways of understanding. So it could have been strategies. Anxiety is something that has been also researched quite extensively. Anxiety during tests and also anxiety in conversations. And we know that there is a direct correlation between performance and and anxiety. Now, how they affect each other, whether there's a causal relationship isn't so clear, but definitely it is. We can see that correlational relationship in many of the studies that have been published, and this can, in a sense, also influence the way we teach listening. So, for example, Suzanne Graham, in one of her opinion pieces in language testing 2017, if I remember correctly, talks about how teachers are increasingly becoming very concerned about students' anxiety. And in the process, teachers might actually lower expectations of what students can do instead of giving them the scaffolding to help them understand text that could be slightly more challenging. And all these have an impact on listening outcomes in the ways that I have explained earlier about how, for example, when May was practicing on her own, how it could, because she could hear more, it also affected herself, her confidence. Now, there are also other studies on many of these factors. Because of time, I'm not going to go into many of these, but at the end of this talk, I will give you a list of selected bibliography in case some of you would like to follow up on some of the studies that have been conducted. Maybe something to say about working memory as well. We know that it is important to have working memory to process the information, but the study that is coming out also tells us that working memory is not the most important aspect of second language comprehension. So I'm just using this by way of exemplifying how the different facets or different parts of this model may influence one another. I will now want to go a bit further into cognitive and social processing. I'm not going to say much about external context because I think these are situations that we're very familiar with. So let me highlight the second strand or the second component of this model, which is the cognitive, social, and strategic processing. So under processing, there are many models or many frameworks that have been presented, and I'm just putting up 3 here. It also depends on whether it is listening for a particular context. So these are 3 frameworks that have been used for general listening. John Field talked about 2 processes. He doesn't use, for example, he doesn't use skills very specifically. He prefers to talk about processes, and these are decoding processes as well as meaning building processes. And Ross talks about different kinds of processing. Linguistic processing, which actually processes the words. We could call, like decoding. What Field also talk about lexical segmentation. You find that in linguistic processing by Ross as well. Semantic processing, understanding the words, the meaning of the message, and pragmatic processing, which goes beyond just understanding the words, but understanding the nuances of the way language is used in particular context. Larry Vandergrift and I presented 3 aspects of this cognitive, social, and strategic processing. One is we adopted a cognitive psychology model of cognitive processing, which refers to 3 overlapping and iterative phases of perception, which is hearing the sounds, it's like decoding, parsing, transforming the perceived information into some kind of mental model, and utilization, using the information for specific purposes. So, for example, if you are in a conversation, then you may need to use the information to respond to somebody. Or in some cases, we simply elaborate on interpretation and store it. So these are 3 cognitive phases that are not linear. Most of the time it's not linear, but they are iterative as well as overlapping. Comprehension strategies have also been written about a lot. There are many ways of classifying these strategies, but I would just want to say that strategies are important for learners because they help learners to do 2 things. One is learners can very intentionally try to plug a gap in their understanding. when they hear something, they don't get it, but maybe they're using some ways to come up with some kind of reasonable interpretation. Another function of comprehension strategies is to help learners improve an understanding. So they probably have derived an interpretation, but they bring in more of their background knowledge to elaborate what they hear, so that the interpretation can be more meaningful and easier to remember for them. Comprehension skills are also important. These are skills that we can use as proficient listeners, listening for details, listening for gist, listening to predict, and so on. So these are just three frameworks that I have put up here. But I think many of us will remember Gary Bart's very influential work, seminal work on assessing listening. And he talks about two kinds of skills. One is the ability to understand and extract explicit information. The other is the ability to infer information from what is heard. So these are just some examples, but they speak to the central part of this framework, which is the processing. In other words, how do learners use the different resources that they have to make sense of what they hear, to process the information into something that will be meaningful to them for the purposes that they have set out when they listen. So this is the second component of the framework. The third has to do with listening outcomes. Now, listening outcomes are, as I said at the start of this presentation, is that something that a lot of teachers think about. And in fact, this is the same for assessors of listening. And very often, we tend to focus on the quantitative outcomes. And these are, for example, comprehension results, right? So if they have a test paper to do, are they able to answer the questions? If they have blanks to fill up, are they able to put in the words that they're supposed to put in? Are they able to give a summary of what they hear? This has to do with some kind of quantitative results, which very often transfers into a kind of a score of the ability to listen. And sometimes it also goes a bit further into learning achievements. So, for example, we may consider some students' understanding of lectures and how that directly influences their performance in a particular subject in the university. So this is the kind of listening outcomes. But very often we think about listening outcomes as in a very quantitative, or rather a very summative way. Very summative because it is supposed to show us the ability of the student at that point in time. But very often we might overlook that quantitative outcomes can also be very important data for learning. So it really depends on how we want to use these outcomes, the purposes for which they serve. In educational purposes, and I want to echo Green here, is, we get data to help us understand where students are in the process of learning and how much more do they need to learn or develop in order to achieve the goals that they have or we have for them. And so it's not strictly to understand the functionality aspects, that is, if they pass a particular test, they are able to be accepted into the next level of a course, for example, or with the results, they are able to do other things, get into a better jobs and so on. So I thought we should, it's important for us to think about quantitative outcomes is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not so reductionist if we, as educators and even assessors of standardized assessors of standardized tests, maybe in a school exam, we can make use of this data to help learners to learn. Qualitative outcomes, I have alluded to this earlier. The performance of a person, a learner in a listening task can directly affect the social emotional characteristics or the responses to the listening. Very often, we hope that students, will develop more confidence, but sometimes the quantitative outcomes could cause them to lose confidence. But the reverse is also true, because if there is a way in which you can support their assessment processes, we can also help them to gain the confidence and the sense of self-efficacy that they need. So just to wrap up this part, listening outcomes are very important part of a model, a systems model, because it gives us a lot of information about the learners. And at the same time, it also helps us to understand some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that learners have. So that's why I put an arrow between performance and social emotional outcomes, because it can go different ways, but there is an interaction between these two. So coming back to this systems model of second language listening, just as you can see here, there are actually three main parts. Once again, the factors that influence second language listening, both internal as well as external factors, and how this influences the processing of the oral input that students have, whether it is a one-way listening or interactive listening situation. And at the same time, this processing will have an impact, direct impact on the outcome, whether it is quantitative or qualitative. It will have both give us the data to help us understand learners learning better. So let me move now into assessment. Again, I want to borrow a quote from Tony Green here, which I find it really speaks to the heart of why we do assessment in language education. And I'm just going to park the standardized assessment aside for now. The practice of language assessment, I read, needs to be closely linked to the ways in which results will be used and interpreted. In educational settings, this means there must be an interdependent relationship between teaching, learning, and assessment. Language assessment is inseparable from the teaching and learning of languages. I think at this point in time, we are all very familiar with not just the more traditional ways of looking at assessment, which is formative and summative, but also in the diverse range of assessments and the purposes for which they serve. So assessment for learning is something that will speak to many of us as educators, because when we assess a learner, we get the information not just about how well they do, as I did when I first started off as a teacher. I feel very disappointed if some of my students didn't do very well, but it is that information that will help a teacher understand where some of these challenges are. And I think this is, when it comes to research, I think this is where our researcher colleagues who are looking at assessment will be able to tease out some of the variables in the big standardized exams. But in the classroom, for the teacher, there are also many ways of doing assessment that are not so controlled, not so standardized or structured. Right, so we talk about assessment for learning, which is an important part is for the teacher to give feedback on the performance of the students. At the same time, also to get students to do peer assessment, assessing each other, and also to do self-assessment. So this is just an example of how knowing about the different factors of listening may help us as educators and even assessors to design better tasks for our learners. Okay, let me go on to these points first, and I'll come back to some of the earlier quotes. So some considerations for teaching, learning, and assessment. I think we need to recognize the complexities of the listening construct. I think for traditionally, we have looked at the listening construct as the processes or the skills, and we want to see whether the learners whom we assess are able to, for example, listen for details and pick out the information, or whether they're able to listen between the lines and infer a a speaker's intention or even some of the meaning or the information that is missing. At the same time, there is also this washback effect of assessing, especially large-scale assessments that many of our learners in schools and universities also have to face. And that, in a sense, influences the way we construct and design tasks for teaching and learning. So these are just certain things that we need to recognize. I think we need to understand that core skills for listening comprehension are very important. And this is not something new at all, but I think it's something that's worth repeating, that what is it that we are teaching our learners and what it is that we are assessing. And are we able to also, from the information, find out more about some of the difficulties that the students have, the factors that could influence the ability to use certain core skills like prediction or listening for gist. We can also think about how interactive listening competence should play a bigger part. And I want to mention the work by Daniel Lam, who talks about listening competence, interactive listening competence is an important part of the listening construct. But very often when we test listening, this may not come out so clearly. Although I think in the testing of speaking or oral communication, this comes out more. But what does it mean then for designing tasks to help develop interactive listening competence? Pragmatic competence is another example, right, about understanding the nuances in cultural or intercultural communication. Sometimes it's a big C, sometimes it's a small c, culture of a small community or even a student group for that matter. Now, this second bullet point is something I thought is worth thinking about a bit more. We know there are many effective factors that influence our students' performance, not just in class, but also in large-scale exams. We've seen how listening anxiety can actually has a big influence on some of the performances. And if we think about this whole idea about fairness in assessing, are there ways in which we can recognize the anxiety that students face and at the same time try to assess them in ways that can give us some information about their learning or about their proficiency at a particular point in time? I pose this as a question because I don't have an answer, but I thought this is something that is worth thinking about. So for example, maybe the partial answer comes in the third bullet point. Is it possible to combine quantitative and qualitative outcomes in our teaching and learning and assessing, for that matter? Even in formal and standardized tests, is there a place, for example, where students or candidates can self-report on their level of anxiety when they're doing a particular test? I know these are perhaps a bit far-fetched, but I'm just thinking about, this whole interactive systems model of listening, where one part affects another and to all intents and purposes, it affects the outcomes. And in some cases, outcomes can be very high stakes. So these are just some thoughts. Now, when it comes to teaching, I just want to just mention very briefly here that we need to adopt a learner-oriented approach. And I would propose here a metacognitive approach based on metacognition, which is a learner's understanding or knowledge of their own learning, in this case listening, and at the same time the ability to orchestrate some of their learning activities and learning processes. This helps to make listening processes more visible. So in other words, we're talking about not a traditional listening classroom where students listen to input and try to come up with, ways of demonstrating their understanding. This is a strong washback effect. And we see that in many countries, in Singapore as well. We see that, sometimes teachers teach to what comes out in the format of a listening exam. Learning how to listen. Can we provide opportunities to create awareness help students to introspect on how they listen. So, for example, the listening diaries gives an a way of helping us to understand how they can reflect on their own learning difficulties. And then in the classroom, we can actually help them to think about how they learn. And all this, of course, we hope to bring towards this outcome of a more self-directed and more strategic listener. So this is just a very, very quick presentation of a systems model of second language listening, where all the different components have influence one another. They're interactive, and the way we design our teaching and learning activities, as well as assessment tasks, will and can demonstrate these different aspects. But it may be more challenging in some contexts than others. But I think it is probably worth thinking about second language listening, not just in terms of the skills or the strategies or the processes or the outcomes, but also in terms of how person factors, both internal factors and external factors, can influence the processing as well as the outcomes of our learners and our test takers. So these are just some of the references that I didn't have time to go into, but feel free to take a screenshot of this. And you'll find that there's a lot of very interesting studies nowadays that compare different factors and their interrelationship and their prominence in listening. Just as the resource, if some of you are interested in understanding more about metacognition, I have a video that's on YouTube, and a lot of the things that I've shared with you are from the book that Larry and I wrote, and we just have a second edition that came out last year. So thank you once again. I can see Tony there. I'll pass the time back to Tony, and I'm going to stop sharing my file. Okay.
Terrific. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
So I should say to everyone, before you start taking too many screenshots, we will be sharing the slides with Christine's permission after this, so you will be able to access them via the CRELLA website.
So I'm trying to stop share, but I can't seem to... got the button. Okay.
Great.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so there are lots of questions that have come up. I'll start maybe with one of the more technical ones. So someone has asked if you could say a little bit more about the role of working memory in listening. You mentioned a recent study, and could you learn a little bit more about that?
Yes, working memory has been researched, particularly in the last 10 years, I think. And very often working memory in a research project is measured in terms of a battery of psychology tests, like span tests and so on. And from my own reading, I find that is used a lot, even in second language research. At the same time, in terms of the results, we find that working memory does have an influence, but many of the studies actually show that the relationship is not significant. In some studies, the relationship is significant, but overall, the way I would look at it at this point is that it is really inconclusive. And one of the reasons could be the different kinds of tests that were used for working memory. Like I said, because you tap into a lot of the tests that are used in psychology. And one of the issues also is the language in which these tests are conducted, and whether we're testing working memory in second language or working memory in the first language. So yeah, so I hope that sort of gives a glimpse to what I think is the landscape right now.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so there was a lot of interest as well in the qualitative outcomes of listening. And one of the questions that came up was around positive relationships. Could you maybe say a little bit more about that, and what kinds of positive relationships are the outcomes you're talking about, and what might teachers do to encourage those?
Okay. Okay, so since you mentioned teachers, Tony, I would put this in the classroom context. I remember when I was teaching students who are the EFL learners, but they're trying to, improve their listening in English in the Singapore situation. One of the things they told me is that some of the students told me is that they were very nervous because they were so afraid that they couldn't understand what the teacher was telling them, and because of that, again, because of the nervousness, the anxiety, it could have also influenced their ability to concentrate, and then it's almost like a vicious circle. Then they won't respond, because one part about listening, especially in a classroom, is they have to respond, right? Whether it's responding to a teacher's question or responding to a task where everybody has to do together. And so they might become very withdrawn. Some of them actually say, this is the avoidance strategy we all talk about, but this is for listening. But at the same time, if the teacher is able to help the students understand what is being said in different ways, scaffolding their understanding in using some aids, for example, then the students would would become more confident. And I think that would, in some way, help to develop a stronger, a more positive relationship in the classroom between the learners and the teachers. Of course, you can think about other relationships as well. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, so another questioner has asked about the differences between higher level and lower level learners in this respect. So would you see there's different strategies, teaching strategies working better with lower level and higher level learners?
Okay. Okay, so very often we also have classes where there are mixed ability. Of course, sometimes you have classes that are, streamed according to proficiency. But I would say that yes, some studies have also shown that lower learners can benefit from learning to use strategies, for example. I think very often we hear the view that, learning to use strategies is only for high-level learners because they are already able to perceive certain things. But I remember a study by Yeldam. It's in one of the, in the references at the back, that where he conducted a comparative study looking at, not comparative, sorry, like an experimental study, two groups of learners. One group was taught decoding skills, and another group was taught decoding as well as strategies, use of strategies. And the results, if I remember, I can't remember the exact result, but the overall result was that even though some of them were lower ability learners, they actually benefited from learning decoding as well as other kinds of listening strategies. So I would say that sometimes it has to do with the classroom as well. But some of these studies that are coming out actually shows us that there is hope even for some of the lower ability learners, but definitely not the beginners, because we know, for beginners, there are many things that they need to cope with before they can even start to use strategies. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. There's another rather detailed question that I'm going to read out to you from somebody who works on an examination program.
Okay.
So I wonder if you feel the audio we typically use in assessments are adequate, in the sense that they're read scripts rather than real examples of talk. And how might this be reflected in your model? For example, in terms of candidate anxiety, being able to use pragmatic knowledge, interactional knowledge, etc.
Okay, thanks. So there are two parts to this question, I think. One is the input, that some of the recordings may be very unnatural, not authentic, as opposed to something which is natural language, which natural language can also be very messy, as we know. So how do we strike a happy medium between something that is almost like reading out and something that is more natural with a lot of features of natural speech? I would think that one way is to look at the language in the text, because very often when a passage or a text is read out, the text itself wasn't meant for listening. The text itself was meant for reading. So we read a passage from something that's in a book or published in a magazine, and we ask our students to try and listen and understand. And we know that there is such a big difference between written language and spoken language. So I would say that it is okay to read out and record. But to me, I think the more fundamental question we need to ask ourselves is that language in the text meant for listening or speaking?
So thinking about the kinds of tests that we see used internationally, what would be the one thing you'd most like to change about the way they test listening?
Thank you. Well, I mean, on the one hand, I actually said something earlier when I was talking about is there any way where we can acknowledge anxiety in testing of listening, right? But I think that's probably not the intent, the meaning of this particular question. But I really think that's something we need to think about. It depends on that there's so many tests around the world on listening, and many of the response items have a lot of reading involved. And I think John Field has done a lot of work in this. My colleague Vahid Ayadus has also done a lot of work in this. And that is, what exactly are we testing? I think we go back to the whole issue of construct validity. So I would say that, especially for high-stake exams, it is good to review the kind of responses that are elicited or needed from the candidates to see whether these are really items that elicit understanding, or more than that requires reading, and sometimes reading very long print text as well. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. So yeah, I'm intrigued by the idea of including anxiety or measures of anxiety in tests. Do you have any idea how that might be done?
The short answer is no. But I was thinking that, anxiety is something, it's actually self-reported, because nobody can really tell how anxious we are. We ourselves will be able to do that. So in teaching in the classroom, one of the things that I would advocate, and this is not for the big large-scale exam, in the classroom, is that we actually have instruments, simple instruments, where students can chart their anxiety levels. And I have some diagrams in the book with Larry Vandergrift on how we can use this with the students. If we are doing assessment in the classroom, I think it'd be very useful to also put that alongside the kind of responses the students need to show their comprehension. So when we talk about assessment for learning and educational purpose of assessment, I think both the qualitative and the quantitative responses will help us understand our learners more and help us to take them a bit further in the goals that they have for learning.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I'm really, really pleased with the way you've put learners at the centre of all of this. I think that's so important. I think we now need to move on, as Nikki's appeared back on screen. So there are lots more questions, but we can't go there, unfortunately.